would join me now, John chapter 9. There's a word that I would share with you with the help of the Holy Spirit. Thank you for all of those auxiliaries that loaned me your credit time. I knew I'd need some of it, amen, because I'm just taking my text now for those who are monitoring it, amen. It's 8:58, so I want to let y'all know that I'm going to do my best, amen, to cut across the field and say a word on behalf of our sponsor. John chapter 9, if you join me in this text. Our theme, shaping our future through sharing and showing our faith. There is a story of a blind man that is nestled in this text. If you join me in the reading of this, read along as I read. You can read silently as I read aloud. I don't want to read the usual parts that we normally read, verses 1 through 4. I want to skip down to verse 18, where it reads, "But the Jews did not believe concerning him, that he had been blind and received his sight, until they called the parents of him that had received his sight. And they asked them, saying, Is this your son, who ye say was born blind? How then doth he now see? His parents answered them and said, We know that this is our son, and that he was born blind. But by what means he now seeth, we know not. Or who hath opened his eyes, we know not. He is of age, ask him. He shall speak for himself." These words spake his parents because they feared the Jews. For the Jews had agreed already that if any man did confess that he was Christ, he should be put out of the synagogue. Therefore said his parents, He is of age, ask him. Then again called they the man that was blind, and said unto him, Give God the praise. We know that this man is a sinner. Speaking of Jesus. He answered and said, Whether he be a sinner or no, I know not. One thing I know, that whereas I was blind, now I see. Then said they to him again, What did he to thee? How opened he thine eyes? He answered them, I have told you already, and you did not hear. Wherefore would you hear it again? Will ye also be his disciples? Then they reviled him and said, Thou art his disciple, but we are Moses' disciples. We know that God spake unto Moses. As for this fellow, we know not from whence he is. The man answered and said unto him, Why herein is a marvelous thing, that ye know not from whence he is, and yet he hath opened mine eyes. And the people of God said, Amen. For these few moments that are mine, I want to conclude this message by saying to you, first of all, that I have prayerfully made a decision that this will be my last year as your moderator. As of this time next year, I will seek, if you would allow me to serve one more year. I'll seek to serve this last year, and at the conclusion of that year, it is mine to descend, and my strong recommendation is that you would receive our first vice moderator, Pastor Orville Littlejohn, as your moderator. He's an able man, and he's able to carry us the last leg of this race. This is not a 100-yard dash. It's a relay race. And I believe that in the work that is to be done, that the energy that he can bring and the vision that he can bring and the elevation he can bring will take us to greater heights in the work that we are seeking to do. And I humbly also believe that if you get with him and get behind him at that point of the transition of our leadership, that who knows what it might propel him to be able to establish and do as we try to strengthen this state work and this national work. And while he's prophetically looking at others, I prophetically look at him. And I say, greater things shall you do. Michigan District, if you will allow me to work close with him in this next year, I want to make this a year of transition. And as I ascend to do greater work and other work as well, I will continue to work with Michigan District. My next work and word of commendation to you will come as my last message as moderator this time next year, if you allow me. But at that point, I want to pass on the baton, if you would receive it, to Reverend Orville K. Littlejohn. Look at your neighbor and say, neighbor, tell your own story. Facebook is a cultural phenomenon created some 10 or so years ago by Mark Zuckerberg, Andre McCullum, and Ed Saverin. This is an individualized, personalized collection of pages that allows the page owner the creative license and censored ability to tell their story. On a daily, even hourly basis, people share their thoughts, ideas, pictures, opinions, and often too much of their business. They now have a section now, Kelvin, called Your Story. This area called Your Story is a section where you can post and publish things of interest and significance to you. People sit all day long with work to do, but they'll just look at everybody's story, flipping and letting it flip over and over. And they'll show and share some of the most ungodly things you've ever seen. But every now and then, you'll see something that might inspire you. It doesn't stay up long, just 24 hours in length. But you scroll through on this time basis, and whatever you want to say on today, whatever's meaning for you in this 24-hour cycle, people will look to see what is your story. Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller testified before the House Intelligence and the House Judiciary Committees, having been summoned. He didn't want to go, but he went to be compelled to tell. Why did they need him to come and testify, having read the report and having heard his brief, non-questioned press conference? Because after all the half-truths, mistruths, alternative facts, and flat-out lies, they needed him to tell America his story. So what's your story? Who knows your story? How often do you share your story? When was the last time you updated your story? Do you discuss only past events of your story or future events that you believe will reveal the promise God has placed on your life? Your past experiences shape and form your story. Will the telling of your story benefit or burden someone else's story? Will they be healed or helped? Will they be hurt or hindered? But your story ought to help somebody else's story. Our lives are like an open book on which we write stories and episodes on a daily basis. I would say to you, you ought to move from just having subscription to a Facebook, and you ought to ground your story in a faith book. I said you ought to shift from trying to get friends on your Facebook page and find some stories and some old school friends in your faith book. You got to be careful who you let inform your story. From the introduction of our birth, the early chapters of our life and our childhood, the many chapters and even others, we have volume sets, if you live long enough, unique to tell your story. We are all an ongoing story. Ambrose is a complex mixture of drama and comedy, action and horror, animation and sci-fi, thriller, and some of y'all got some R and X-rated moments on your story. Yes. But the shaping of the future through the sharing and showing of our faith, which is our theme, suggests that every generation has a significant story, and Michigan District, we got to make room for all of our stories. The stories that would once comprise and written for some people during the sunrise of their life are now being crescendoed as they face the sunset as it sets in their life. Old stories must make way for new stories that are now being composed. And let me just say to you, by way of this theme, as I sat and listened this week to all of those who shared, and our layman president and our Congress president, but particularly Sister Shirlene, who was not scheduled to preach this week. But she was slated at the last minute, but thank God she was ready to tell her story. Let me say to you, destination is God's business, but preparation is yours. You never know when your story is going to have a chance to be told. You never know when your story is going to have a chance to be elevated. You don't know when your story is going to have a chance to be exposed, but you need to be ready when your moment comes. I'd rather have a story and my moment never come than my moment come and I ain't ready to tell my story. Let me just say, by way of those of you who want points, first of all, let me say everybody has a story to tell. Shirlene said from the age of 4, as I was in a Haitian camp and a person of refugee, I never thought that I'd be in the district that's supporting the very place that helped me form my story. I'd add to it, she never thought she'd be the daughter-in-law of the man who faithfully goes over there every year, helping establish things. And as the work he's done faithfully now, his seed is sharing mission stories. You never know how your story is going to help somebody else's story. You must learn to know your story, be proud of your story, and never be ashamed to tell your story. We must demand to become even a greater part of America's story in 2020. Stacey Abrams has challenged us that we must demand the right to vote and the right to be counted. Yes, we must know that the census is just as important as the ballot box. The 2016 election in Michigan alone, 90,000 people left the top of the ticket open and didn't vote for president. You didn't tell your story. Over 200,000 registered voters didn't vote at all. You didn't tell your story. 53,000 people who lost their license due to responsibility fees that got outlawed, been wiped out for over a year, but you ain't going to get your license renewed and update your voter registration. You won't get a chance to tell your story, but tell your story in 2020. We lost Michigan by just a few of these votes that could have been done had you just known to tell your story. Quit hiding from census takers. Quit hiding from those. They, by law, cannot turn you in. It ain't but 8 questions. You got more questions than that on any test you got in school. We must tell our story like Fannie Lou Hamer told her story. In an American democracy, you must know that the law is king. The king is not the law. And when kings do not rule righteously, we must remind them they weren't elected as king. But whatever happened to our ability to remember that our story was shaped by those who were the founding fathers, who helped us to understand what this American story is about? Whatever happened to the story that defines it? Because you will find out that people will define you based on how they see you. Whatever happened to e pluribus unum, out of many one? We were founded on many stories, living in these yet-to-be United States. Whatever happened to we find these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. But if you look at what we're doing now, not if you're an immigrant coming from the South, not if you got black or brown skin, not if you're from some Caribbean or Haitian or Cuban nation, we open up for people coming from Norway by way of Lady Liberty, but we didn't shut the door on our southern and western border. We are witnessing an America that is shifting from the shared vision of the American song, "This land is your land, this land is my land." And we going back to the separatist, nationalistic Tennessee Ernie Ford, "This is my country, this is my country." That's what they're singing again. No, it's not your country. If somebody else was here when you got here, it ain't your country. When you instituted a chattel slavery system of American Africans who came and they built everything and you hijacked everything and you made them work sun up and sundown with no pay, it ain't your country. When every major invention you took credit for was stolen from someone you enslaved, built up for a country, and we built everything from Wall Street to Pennsylvania Avenue, doggone it, it ain't your country. This is my Father's world. Can I get a witness here? Christians must forsake this racist, myopic, nationalistic song and sing. Lift every voice and sing. Till earth and heaven ring. Ring with the harmony of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling seas. We got to sing our song. If you don't tell your story, they will steal your ideas and your inventions like they did Eli Whitney and so many others. They will steal your song, your dance, your poetry, and your prose and tell you not to shout. And then they go somewhere and shout and call it charismatic. Pentecostalism didn't start with white Assemblies of God or four-square churches, but a black man named Mason on Azusa Street. But folk will steal your joy and tell it as their story. Well, I'll tell you, the text reminds us as we read it that this blind man in verses 10 and 11 is excited to tell his story. Unlike other blind people, Jesus healed. Yes, this man has a unique story to tell. I wish I had time to tell you that this ain't the only blind man he's healed. He's healed others like he did in Mark 8, and he's healed others like he's done in others in different kind of ways. But this man has a unique story. We have too many people who try to make their story sound like other people's story, or their testimony sound like other people's testimony. They got to pump it up and juice it up. But let me just tell you, if you tell your own story, can't nobody tell your story like you tell yours. There's power and credibility in your own story. This blind man didn't have to hook up with no other blind man to know how Jesus healed. He had his own story. And that leads me to my next point. Don't let anyone else's story negate yours. Nor do you let them tell or publish it without your participation and your permission. Some people would prefer you stay blind. Some people would prefer you stay deaf and mute. See nothing and hear nothing and say nothing. But open your doggone black mouth and tell your story. Your story expresses the lens by which you view things, and others won't be informed until you tell your story. Some folk act the way they act because they think their story is the only story because you refuse to tell your story. When you let other folk tell your story, they will tell the wrong and twisted version of the story. Whoever writes and publishes your books controls your mind and ultimately your destiny. What we know and learn in schools, passed off as history, is actually the glorified hysteria of white America that talks about chopping down cherry trees and never telling a lie. But the truth is that the romanticized version of our history can never right the wrongs of our past if we don't tell the true story. Our books are now being published from areas in southern parts of our country that never got over the Civil War. And they're shipping them up north, and our children are learning divided history. They're making slavery sound like it was a good idea. Everybody had a job. Everybody had something to eat. They're romanticizing our story. Jews ain't going to let you tell their story. They tell their own story. They have rites of passage and bar mitzvahs to showcase their youth's ability to tell their story. By the time they're 12, boys and girls can tell the story of Old Testament. Meanwhile, we let others write and tell our story like we're some lazy, shiftless buffoons. If we were that lazy, how do we endure sun up to sundown, picking cotton, sugar cane, tobacco for no pay, raising families and theirs too, and still survive? The doggone it, we are kings and queens. We didn't come from slaves. Tell your story. Look at your neighbor and say, tell your story. The question is, do we know our story? So that we not only can tell it, but correct it when other folk don't tell it right. L.H. Welcher, in his book, Slave Narratives, and Van Satima, in his book, They Came Before the Mayflower, helps us to give the right version of our story that you're not going to see in majority culture books. That's why we got to teach them in our vacation Bible schools, because can't nobody tell us that we can't tell them about our history and Jesus' history. We didn't start out doing this just now. This is how our ancestors raised up when they segregated us, when they kept us from going to their schools and others. We organized our own so we could tell our own story. When other people tell your story, they will put their spin on it and then make theirs the official version. Let me just say to you, beloved, that people who will try to steal your identity and tell your story are like the people in this text. There are people who are now looking down on these 4 congresswomen they call the squad, who dared to stand up and speak out when 45 challenged them to go back to their country. But whatever you think about them, they didn't mind telling their story. Ocasio-Cortez, who came from her background, Presley, who came from her background, Omar, who came from her background, Talib, who came from her background, all of them different backgrounds, different cultures, but they came together and said, if nobody else tells their story, we're going to stand up and tell ours. The president said he don't have a racist bone in his body. That's because racism is running from his head to his toe. It's not just in the body and the bone, it's in the marrow. And if you're going to get that out, you ain't going to get the racism out. You got to get him the hell out. He's never apologized for even taking an $85,000 ad against acquitted Central Park 5 that DNA and a confession proved they didn't do it. He ain't never going to tell your story right. Same man that said there were good people on both sides of a heinous Charlottesville race-ending riot, tragic death. He will never tell your own story. As I said last week, Trump is not just a racist, but for him to say he's not a racist is like saying Colonel Sanders never fried a chicken. The text says that there's a problem. And the text problem, watch it, Michigan District, is around a young man that used to be blind. Charlene, why are people and church folk comfortable with your blind testimony? But they ask questions and get nervous when you start seeing and telling your story. As long as you quiet and blind and a little girl that can't talk, people don't mind you being in church. But when you start seeing and saying what you see and telling your story and preaching it from the authority that God has given you, some folk ain't gonna like your story. Pharisees wouldn't even talk to him. This young man had been miraculously healed, but they negated him maybe because of his young age. They addressed and asked his parents about his story, and he was standing right there. Michigan District, we can't do that to our young people. You want to know some of y'all plugging up years when my young people were dancing and miming and jumping? That's because when I say earth to earth, ash to ashes, dust to dust, that's going to be the people who tell the Michigan District story. And we got to give them space now, because later on, if we don't do it by evolution, they'll take it by revolution. We got to let them tell their story. We can't stand in the way of this current and next generation's opportunity to tell the story their way. The disciples weren't even talking to this boy. But the text says they didn't want talking to him, but they were somewhere talking about him. I know that don't happen in Michigan District, but you got some church folk that will never talk to you, but they'll get on the parking lot and talk about you. Talk about how he used to be blind. Talk about how he used to be broke. You see, back in those days, blindness biblically was tied to economic depravity. That's why the words blind beggar went together, Dr. Chapman. Blind and begging went, because if you couldn't see your way to be able to help. And some folk in America have been stricken blind because they want to keep you broke when you can't see how to hold on to your own money, when you can't see how to support your own businesses, when you can't see how to help your own neighborhoods. If people want to shoot people taking a bag of potato chips, shut the whole store down and build your own and see your way to go beyond protests. Disciples in this text had a long talk with each other. The problem was the boy was blind, not deaf. Young people hear you talking. I said he was blind, not deaf. Children hear what you're saying. They tried to revamp and revise his story. But he said, I got a story, but thank God his parents had sense enough to say, he's of age. Let him tell his own story. And that's what we got to do with our young people. We need to say, they're of age. Let them tell their own story. We must seek to discover and promote what's common in our different stories, because different doesn't mean deficient. We have to learn our history. So we need to know that they have to not only learn theirs, but ours too. My only challenge to you young people is you got to know your story and other stories also. You got to know African history and European history and Asian history and, yes, other cultures' history. Your story is not the only one. New school music didn't just get on the scene. Most of it has been sampled from some old school stories. If you give me Kirk Franklin, I'll give you Andre Crouch. If you give me Tasha Combs, I'll give you a Mahalia Jackson. You give me Mary, I'll give you a Clark Sisters. You give me Sean Carter, I'll give you Sam Cooke. You give me Beyonce, I'll give you Aretha Franklin. You give me Bruno Mars, I'll give you Stevie Wonder. You give me Tank, I'll give you Marvin Gaye. If you give me Carter B, I'll give you Tina Marie. If you give me Drake, I'll give you Michael Jackson. If you give me Migos, I'll give you the Mighty Temptations. If you give me Lil Nas X, you know, they're going to take my horse to the old time road. Going to ride till I can't no more. Give me Lil Nas X. I'll give you Little Richard. You give me Justin Timberlake. I'll give you Bobby Caldwell. You give me Chris Brown. I'll give you James Brown. You got to know everybody's story. Tell your neighbor, tell your story, but know the whole story. Yes, I know you know Cardi B, but do you know Harriet T? I know you know Dr. Dre, but do you know Dr. Daniel Hale Williams? I know you know Rick Ross, but do you know Diana Ross? I know you know Jay-Z, but do you know Malcolm X? I know you know Little Pup, Little Kim, and Little Wayne, but do you know Martin, Malcolm, and Mandela? I know you know, yes, Future, but do you know your future? I know you know her, but do you know him? Yes, it's time that you tell your story. I'm out of here when I close by telling you the blind man was confronted in verse 17 by those who questioned his story. They said, give glory to God. What they was really saying, Pastor Branch, is they wanted an old school story, but they wasn't ready for a new school Jesus. They wasn't ready for a man now who claimed that he was now come through 40 and 2 generations. They could handle Moses, but they can't handle Jesus. Let me tell my young people, be careful of these new school movements, these new Hebrew Israelite movements who try to take your old school Old Testament and don't complete the story in the new. Can I get a witness here? You got to have the whole story. give glory to God, but not Jesus. They want the Father, but they don't want the Son. They want Adonai, but they don't want the answer and the access. Our ancestors had sense enough to sing songs like "When I Come to Die, Give Me Jesus." I'm closing one last point. When I tell you, don't confuse your story with the objective whole truth. I hear young people, they talk about this is my truth. Look at your neighbor and say, neighbor, you may have a story, you may have a version, but you don't have your own truth. Ain't but one truth. It's called the gospel. That's what the young boy said. I got a story. It ain't like the other blind people. Some folk he spoke to and they got healed. Some folk he waved at and they got healed. But I come from a background that I believe that the spirit of a good man had healing power. I come from a Salome territory, and Jesus said, if you believe spit can heal you, he spit on the ground, made a salve, said, let me do it a new school way. Jesus is willing to give sight to a new generation, a different way he gave to us. Generation X, Y, and Z may not get it from the old school baby boomers, but look at your neighbor and say, neighbor, the power is not in the version of your story, but the power is, I once was blind, but now I see. Say yeah, say yeah. Good night, Michigan District. Tell your story. Good night, Michigan District. Run and tell your story. Shake somebody's hand and say, I've got a story to tell to the nation. Can I get a witness here? The Bible says Jesus broke all the rules to let this man have a story. He healed him on the Sabbath day. I heard Tolan Morgan say, God can bless you and break every rule in the process. If an EMS truck, can I get a witness here, was needed in the house because Jason got sick, if a fire broke out and we needed a fire truck because we needed to put the fire out at Liberty Temple, I don't want them to follow the rules. I don't want them to stop at the stop sign. I don't want them to stop at the stoplight. I want them to break every rule. I want them to bust through every intersection. I want them to go through every barrier because I need a miracle. Is there anybody here that knows that God broke every rule? He came down and broke every rule to give you your miracle, to give you your story. Say yes, say yeah. I'm out of here now. I didn't fool around and got happy. Look at your neighbor and say, neighbor, I got a story and I gotta tell it. Tell your story till blind people see. Tell your story till deaf people hear. Tell your story till white folk get saved. Tell your story till black folk act up and get right. Tell your story until America becomes united. Tell your story until the church gets triumphant. Yes, I heard Fanny Crosby said, I know you got a story, but she wrote with a blind self. She couldn't see, but she said, I can't tell you a seeing story, but blessed assurance, Jesus is mine. Oh, what a foretaste of glory divine. I'm an heir of salvation, purchase of God, born of his spirit, washed in his blood. This is yeah, this is my story. This is my song. I know he's all right. you have a story? Can you tell your story? I don't need to be the only one in this house that hollers. If you got a story, let me hear you scream. Say yeah! Say yeah! Say yeah! No is a. There was a boy who had his father go with him to go see his grandfather. And when he got to his grandfather's house, he had the ability to walk in the door. His grandfather looked at him. He said, "That's my grandson. I'm proud of that boy." He said, "That's my grandson." Told the boys, his friends that are around, he's an all-state, all-school basketball player. The little boy looked at his daddy, and he said, "Daddy, are you sure you sent him the right tape? Because I sat on the bench half the year. I fouled out several times. I didn't do well all the time. I had some good moments, but I had a whole bunch of bad ones." So he was wondering why his grandfather was bragging on him as an all-stater. The father whispered to the son. He said, "Well, son, let me tell you what I did. I know you had a complete story, but what I did, I took the highlights of your story. I just sent him the free throws you made. I just sent him the passes that got completed. I just sent him the dunks that you made. And all he saw was the highlights of your story. Well, the reason I'm going to stick with Jesus, and I'm out of here, Keisha, but the reason I stick with Jesus, because your story is not complete without Calvary. Because on Calvary, he erases the bad part of your story. On Calvary, the blood came down, and the story that looked bad, the Godfather of God never sees it, because Jesus died one Friday. Jesus stayed in the grave, and he rose with an eraser and took out the bad parts and covered it with his blood. Give God praise, because his only instructions was to tell the women, to tell the disciples, "Now run and tell your story." Hallelujah. Hallelujah. Doors open.